TellyCast.
Hi, I'm Justin Crosby, and welcome to another TellyCast. My guest this week is documentary filmmaker, president of Cry Havoc Productions, Dylan Weiss, and author of new book, Factual Television Producing, a hands-on approach from conception to delivery. Dylan, welcome to TellyCast.
Justin, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Great to have you here. Thank you for visiting us from Santa Barbara, California, right?
Yes. It's I'm a long way from home, but London is one of the great factual content hubs of the world. And so I try to make it out here a few times a year.
All right. So you're pitching as your life depends on it around London, right?
That's the life of a documentary filmmaker.
Absolutely. Well, listen, really fascinating that you've written a book on all the aspects, and it's very, very detailed, and we'll come on to that in a second. But first of all, why are you writing this book? What makes you qualified to write the book, and why did you write it?
That's a very good question. I think what makes me qualified to write it is I've been in the space for 20 years, over 20 years actually, running my own production company. And a lot of people come to me and they have an idea and they don't really know where to start. And I just thought that there's a white space out here between what gets taught in university, or uni as you guys like to call it, and the sort of practical knowledge about how to do stuff. And I think what we're seeing in today's world is that you have a lot of people taking production into their own hands with the YouTubeification of the world, but there's still a sort of knowledge gap between being your own content creator and being a broadcast content creator. And so I thought this could be something that would fill that void. The project actually started during COVID, to be honest. So I am fortunate enough to live in Santa Barbara, California, like you said. We have a brilliant little community college, Santa Barbara Community College. They're just a 2-year university, but they have a really banging film and television department. And so the dean and I have become friends. And every year to keep their accreditation, the dean has to speak with folks who are in the industry actively working. So the truth is that 4 or 5 of us in town who work in the business or different parts of the business, we get together, throw back a couple beers at the beach, a little pub there, and just talk about what's going on in the industry. And it's a lovely little setting. COVID happened and we couldn't get together in person. So the dean asked me to answer a few questions via email. And so I dutifully received the email. I thought about it for a couple of days, banged away at the keyboard, popped off the email, and then woke up the next morning and was like, I probably have some more things to say here. And so I just kept writing. And at the time I was working on a Cheap as Chips list show series that I did for Fred Distribution out of Australia and Discovery Italy. That's called Icons of Auto. And it's the 5 key cars and the 5 key moments that make each car maker famous. And it was just a fun little series. But we did 18 episodes. And I think when you do volume of anything, it becomes a little monotonous at times. It was great that it was a repeatable format, but at the same time, you start banging your head against the wall.
I hope you're not insinuating after 182 episodes of TellyCast, we're getting monotonous.
Oh, no. You, it's much different here. But in any case, at the end of the day, for me, I would wrap up what I'd been working on all day, and the writing became my creative outlet. And I blinked and a couple of months had gone by or something like that. And suddenly I was like, holy smokes, I've got like 150 pages. What do I do with this? And what I realized is that I had put down sort of my belief system of how you do this on paper. And it was the operating manual that I wish someone at university had shared with me, because I went to USC Film in LA, which at the time was a very narrative focused program. Everybody was going to be the next Lucas or Spielberg and make a movie, which is fantastic. And tons of people from the industry come out of that program. But factual television at that time, Discovery was at like the peak of its power. Nat Geo US, I don't even know if Smithsonian was a network yet. We're talking, 2000, 2001, somewhere in there. And I was aware that these factual networks were really growing at this incredible clip at that moment, but nobody in university was talking about them. It was like this multi-billion-dollar industry didn't exist. And yet that was the thing that kind of fascinated me, because I came up as an editor and that just kind of came naturally to me. And my old man was in news. He was Peter Jennings' producer for a long time at World News Tonight. So the reality space or telling the world as you see it, that made a lot of sense to me. And I was just surprised that didn't really exist in a university curriculum at the time. And so when this opportunity came up with COVID and I was writing, and the next thing I knew, I thought, this is really the book that I wish existed for someone like me who was fascinated by this slice of the entertainment pie that often kind of gets overlooked, right? Because most people, when they get in the business, it's like the thing that they aspire to is to be, a mega director, or, maybe it's a limited series, dramatic series on Netflix. And often I feel like, people in the factual space, people end up here for random reasons. Very few set out because they just wanted to be a factual producer.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You find a lot of people fall into the industry in different ways because of the different skill sets. Before we get into the book, tell us a few of your credits then, what you've produced at Cry Havoc.
Sure. Well, I'm just coming off of a 12x60 series for Motor Trend US called Custom Carolina. And prior to that, I finished up Ultimate Supercar 2 for Nat Geo International. We've done 2 seasons of that. I have a wealth of experience in the supercar and automotive space, the engineering science space. Prior to that, I've done a series called Supercar Super Build for Discovery International, 2 seasons of that. SUV Super Build came after that. I'm not doing this in chronological order, so I apologize. Like I said, I did the Icons of Auto series for Discovery Italy and Fred. I did a 5-parter called Supercar Tech for Quintus Media and Velt. And so I've tried lots of different business models. Prior to all that, well, let me backtrack. So my production company has been in business for 23 years. When we started as a father-son production company. Like I said, my dad was in TV. At that time, he was working for Fox Sports and had launched the Regional Sports Report, which was sort of intended to be a regionalized version of an ESPN SportsCenter competitor. Didn't really work the same way that ESPN did. And I think he was frustrated because he was going to meetings to set up the next meeting. And like I said, I came up as a precocious editor at USC. And I was getting to that point really frustrated because I'd get all this footage from people and I'd be like, guys, where's the wide shot? And they'd be like, what's a wide shot? And so something compelled me to say, like, I can do this. Just give me the camera. And so the old man and we took a fateful motorcycle trip up the California coast. I've told this story. A lot of people will have heard this at this point, but we had done like 200 or 300 miles of glorious riding in the day. And we were sitting at this little pub, watching the sunset over the beach, having an adult beverage, and sort of had that quintessential, like, what do you want to do when you grow up conversation? And we both sort of sat there and were like, we want to make original content together. He wanted to get back to rolling up his sleeves and making something. And I was frustrated because I was like ready to make it. And it was very much a classic. If I knew then what I know now, I don't know if you make the jump. There's something about being youthful and brash and plucky and having that naivete that you don't know what you don't know. But we did it. And we were fortunate enough to land our first show. And that got us, another couple shows. And then after that, a few shows after that. And then I took things over in right around 2010. And at that moment, the world had really changed in US American television. This sort of science, tech, engineering programming that we were sort of known for was sort of on the way out. American Chopper had come on the scene for Discovery and had really, I think, pivoted motoring into a male soap opera space. It was no longer about the vehicle or the machine. It was about guys in a garage throwing wrenches at each other and having fisticuffs, right?
It's that kind of Sons of Anarchy, kind of the way that
I mean, in that
Factual.
moment, Jesse James was really big. He's a super tattoos, that kind of stuff. And we were doing something completely different. And so I was very fortunate to meet Paul Haney, then at TCB Media, through Stephen Hunter, who was commissioner at Nat Geo International at the time. And Paul helped me pivot to the international market. And that was sort of eye-opening because it was like, oh, you mean that a network isn't going to do a full commission, but therefore I get to keep rights in places? And that was wild to me.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because when you were talking about your credits, it was a wide range of commissioners or partnering broadcasters within that. And most American producers are work for hire, right? That's it, which is quite a kind of foreign concept, really, unless you're working with Netflix out of the UK. But
it's a brutal business model, though. That's really the key here, I think, is that my sense is most American producers for a very long time, they could sort of survive on 2-3 pilots a year that were full commission pilots that were coming at a really high cost per hour, and maybe like 1 or 2 series, right? And that's like that middle strata production company. All the production companies today that I think are actually hurting, right? Because they have high overhead, they have staff, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But nobody was really thinking about the international market, at least nobody I was interfacing with. It was a very, dare I say it, but kind of like myopic view of television. It was like...
Well, I mean, that's existed in the US industry for a while, hasn't it? Whenever I speak to a US network, it's the US and then it's international.
Yeah.
And international is almost seen as a, very much a secondary kind of priority. Across everything that they do.
No, it's international for years. I think it was the little stepbrother in the back of the station wagon or the estate car, right? Like it was like not primary in people's focus. I think that's ironic because today that's now the game, right? So it's completely shifted. But back then, TV networks were still growing at an incredible clip. There was money to spend. If you were fortunate enough to do like an early, Beekeeper series for 26 episodes for Discovery, you made a pretty good living. It was a different kind of era, I think. And so we came up and we were doing lots of full commissioned hours for like Nat Geo and like the Ultimate Supercar and the Mega Factory strands, the Man-Made strand. It was great when the project was going, and then the project would end, and so would the paycheck. And that was really frustrating to me. And so this idea that you could retain rights and realize royalties later, that was something that I was like, okay, we need to try this. And so kind of bravely went into the unknown and got into the co-production game, sacrificed a little bit of money up front for a much longer tail later on. Honestly, some series have been more successful than others. It is, I think, a leap of faith, and you never know how it's going to turn out. Because what I've learned is like distributor projections are, that's people throwing darts at a board, and maybe it ends up there, maybe it doesn't. You don't know. I think what you need is lots of bullets in your gun. And in other words, you got to have volume. You got to have lots of series and lots of content. And so the way I look at it today is I'm willing to talk to anybody about ideas because it's all about finding the right partners to dance, And I think ultimately the role of a producer today is effectively a matchmaker, right? You have this idea for content, or in my case, access to content or opportunity. And then the network has a need for content, and you're connecting the dots. And that's the game.
So let's talk about the book. 300 pages, 11 chapters, a lot of detail, which is great. There's also quite a few contributors that you've obviously interviewed. So tell us about those, first of all.
Well, so the interesting thing about, I ended up getting the book published by Routledge Press. They are one of the larger educational publishing houses. They do really well with like film schools and things like that. One of the reasons I went with them is because I think this book is best targeted in sort of that like university film program kind of area, and or the person who's always harbored an idea for a series or a documentary, but doesn't know where to start. Like those are the two camps, really.
Okay, so it's not. Is it of use to a relatively inexperienced factual producer who is just, because the way that factual producers are going to come to the industry in the next 5 years is going to be very different to how it's been 10 years ago, right?
Well, I could see this as being usually of value to a precocious like AP or somebody like that who is working for, let's say, a mini major production company, but they're not let in on like, how do we sell this? Or how does, what is the top level thinking? They simply know how to like make the content.
Okay.
Because I think that that's one of the struggles, right? Is like, at least with the folks I interface with, who like guys who work for me, like shooters or editors, stuff like that, is they might have great ideas, but they have no idea how the business works. And I think the reality of that is that like, I don't know, in the 182 podcasts you've done or series, my guess is the vast majority of people who've showed up here, they sort of figured it out, that there wasn't really a manual to say, these are the 7 steps to take. And therefore, if you do these 7 steps and you go to, Harvard or Yale or Oxford, and then you go to Wall Street or Fleet Street, you're going to be set. Like that doesn't exist in our industry, right? It's all people who are hustling constantly.
Yep.
And it's, how are you connected? How can I, convince you to part with your money for this brilliant idea kind of business?
Well, they're quite right. And the most of the bosses of indies that I've spoken to, or entrepreneurs that are trying new things within a content industry, they've kind of figured out the how to make it, and that's less of interest to them. It's about the idea at the beginning, selling that, and then monetizing that, further on down the line. Yeah. The actual putting it together and filming and everything is kind of a spreadsheet, really, and with great people and great crew who know how to do that. So So your book is well. Before you move on, let me swing back to answer your question, because we kind of took a left turn there. But the point I was bringing up with Routledge is the book went through a really healthy peer review process. And so a number of professors at various film programs at big universities in the US
read the book and then had notes and suggestions and things like that. And one of the things that came out of it was, and it was it was an interesting process, but one of the things that came out of it was like, we would really love to have some insight to what the other side of the table thinks. And so I took that to heart and I thought about the people I know in the business. And so there's a wide range of folks depending on the chapters. I mean, I tried to pair it with the right chapters. So, for instance, Ludo Dufour is in the distribution chapter. Babette Perry is in the agent chapter. She's an agent. Matt Taylor is a commissioner or head of NGCI, so he's in sort of the, commissioning section. Marjolaine, who's part of PMD at Nat Geo International and Nat Geo, she's in kind of the budgeting section. So there's a number of folks who I tried to sprinkle in that I thought could add extra context to that sort of discussion. And my hope with it was that way they also just wouldn't think that I was some loon with this, like sitting down at a computer writing, my theories on TV, but instead would say like, okay, this is where that practical information comes from.
Yeah. Well, there's some familiar names down here. Dan Corn, obviously from A&E Networks UK. You mentioned Ludo. Yeah. He's a great friend of mine and a regular listener. So hi, Ludo, if you're listening. And Adam Jacobs, of course, from Quintus Studios. And you mentioned Quintus was a partner that you'd had. That's really interesting because of the new model that Quintus has got and the way that they are going down a much more sort of shared joint venture approach and utilizing YouTube as well as traditional broadcasters. So some great contributors that you have. So like I say, 11 chapters. Let me just whiz through the first 4 to give everybody a sort of feeling of the way into it, which is breaking in, getting started. 8 factual steps, which is the process, idea creation, and crafting the presentation. So basically getting to the point of pitching, which is chapter 5. So give me 2 or 3 nuggets of information in across all that process, because there's a lot of information there. It's about how you craft the deck, cutting a sizzle reel. Well, let's start there actually. What's the ideal way to pitch to a broadcaster now? And we'll say a traditional broadcaster. Is it just on paper? Do you need to have a sizzle? Is it do different broadcasters have different requirements? Because it is a painstaking process, and some would say it's a bit of a nightmare process, the commissioning thing. But tell us about what you think the ideal pitch process is and what you need.
Well, the very first thing I would say, Justin, is I think a lot of people move too quickly. They tend to go in sometimes before everything's ready. And the reality here is you usually get one shot, with a particular broadcast network. I've had a few experiences where that's not the case, where things died and came back and all that kind of stuff. I'm sure everybody has. But the reality is like when they look at it the first time, if it's not instantly exciting to them, you're kind of done. So within that, I'm just old enough to remember being able to sell something in the room. And matter of fact, that's how we sold our first show.
That never happens anymore, does it?
No. Now it's everybody needs to confer with their team and, there's sprinkle magic data on it and figure out whether this is a good idea or not. But, 20 years ago, I think commissioners led with their gut and said, okay, is this something that appeals to who I perceive my audience to be and my market research says is my audience? And they had sort of this idea of like, okay, I know these people really well, and this is an idea that's going to appeal to them. I can see it fitting into this slot. I'm just going to buy it, and we'll figure out how to pay for it later and all that kind of stuff. Today is, I think, a very different discussion. A lot more goes into it. And I can't speak to how networks run on a day-to-day because I don't sit on that side of the fence, but it is a much more laborious process where, this Motor Trend series that I just finished, that took 1.5 years from the first pitch to the green light, and that's not unusual these days. All the while people are, watching the sizzle reel, we can see it on the web stats. So like, conversation is happening, but you don't know what it is. And you don't really know what the thinking is until one day you're, in that case, I was on a shoot here in the UK and the phone rang and was like, we want to make your show. And it was like, okay, that's really amazing.
And how long was that after you'd pitched it?
That was like 1.5 years.
1.5 years. So, and then prior to that, you've been developing the idea, or you getting to a certain point of minimum viable product and then pitching it, and then you carry on developing it, or? Sure.
Well, I'll tell you, with the Motor Trend project in particular, that was a really interesting gestation period because during COVID, I had pitched them a different car builder in the South. And I'd gotten very, very close. We were on the 1 yard line, as we would say in American football. very close to punching it in, and it kind of fell apart right at the end. But at that point, I then knew what they wanted. They wanted a car builder in the South, the southern part of the United States. They didn't really have that on their screen. Because, when you think about the car building genre, fundamentally, the formats are basically the same, right? It's guys in a garage spinning wrenches, restoring a car. The things that separate it are talent, who they are, and then the location. So it's a little bit, in my mind, it's a little bit like the home shows, reality shows of like, selling Hawaii or selling, Beverly Hills or those sorts of things, right? Where it's like the fantasy is almost based more on the location than the person. And so then I went into my network and was sort of just like, who knows somebody in the South? Like, I need help finding the right guy. And so then I found the right guy, a gentleman by the name of Tommy Pike in Greenville, South Carolina. And so met him, flew out, met him in person. We continued the conversation for a little while. And then we were like, all right, we're going to do this. And we went back and shot a sizzle reel, put a deck together. And then that's when we presented that to the network. In this particular case, the network, it was at a stage in the network's life cycle where they were willing to actually fund the sizzle reel, which is sort of a double-edged sword. Good in terms of like, as a production company, you don't have to come out of pocket. Bad because they own the IP. So it's very difficult to get it back to sell to somebody else if it doesn't hit there.
So in that case, if a network, US network, buys your sizzle reel and commissions you for the sizzle reel essentially, and then they say, okay, we like the idea, but maybe we'd get somebody else to make it. Does that happen? Does that still happen? And can that happen?
That's not something I've experienced. So could it happen? I guess so. I mean, it's written in the contract that like, if you're going to take it somewhere else, that, to a different network, that they then have to make, the first network whole.
Right.
And probably then with, whole plus some probably, but I haven't dealt with that.
Okay.
In this particular case though, so it from when we submitted the finished sizzle reel, it was like a 1.5-year process till green light.
Yeah.
When you think about some of the struggles that the industry is currently facing, the really long green light lead times, I think, could potentially be part of the problem. Because back in the day, 10, 15 years ago, it was a much quicker cycle. And so here, you have to be putting your heart and soul into making your product, but at the same time, you have to be figuring out what the product is that you're going to be making right after it, because that quick renewal doesn't necessarily happen as quickly as it used to. And so I think that's a bit of a struggle for a lot of people. And it's an interesting, I guess, comparison to the YouTube model, where you're seeing these young influencers who are publishing, they shoot it and they publish it that day, and their next piece of content comes, the next Tuesday, right? So it's like you have this divergence of, you really love a show, but it's 2 years till you see the next season or something like that, right? Versus you really love an influencer. Well, shoot, next Tuesday, here's their new product, And so I think one of the challenges we face as an industry is like, at its core, television is kind of about training the audience when and where they're going to see the thing that they love. And when we go to these really shorter seasons and there's a lot of space between seasons, I think it gets harder and harder for that network to maintain that audience across.
And you mentioned that, the changing, the slowdown, and in some cases, the complete stop of commissioning, which we've seen in the UK and in the US and to varying degrees. Do you reflect that in the book? Because, things have changed within the last 18 months and they're still changing and still developing. Do you reflect that change in the physical book?
No, I didn't really focus into the market dynamics. And I think what I was trying to do here was create something that was a little more evergreen. Because as you know, with all the folks you talk to, the market changes quickly. I mean, we're talking about how slow it moves, but what's in vogue moves, changes very quickly. And I think we're in this era currently where everybody's trying to figure out what the secret sauce is moving forward. And I don't know that anybody's quite figured it out. No. I mean, especially like just in the flight over here, one of the rumors going around is that Disney is going to put a fast channel behind the paywall on Disney Plus.
Yeah.
Once they do that, and you go back to having basically a linear feed with commercials in it for money, that sounds an awful lot like cable television to me, right? And so I think we're in this moment where it's entirely plausible to me that 10 years from now, people are going to still need content, but it might be that what has really happened is all the big conglomerates have really cut the middleman out, the cable provider, and have simply gone direct to consumer and say, pay us, and here's your traditional television. Because there is, whether it's, the obsession right now with fast channels, YouTube, streaming services, there is a massive curation problem. like, how do you find the thing you actually want, right? Like my girlfriend and I, like we can sit down to watch something, saying we want to watch something, and we can spend an hour scrolling trying to find the thing to watch.
And then you give up.
And yeah, well, by then the time I had to watch the show is gone and it's time to go to bed.
Yeah, I do that a lot.
I think everybody does that, right? It's really frustrating. Or you really have this desire to watch, I don't know, a specific movie, and you click on to, Apple TV and they go like, oh, you got to pay us. And then you're like, oh, well, maybe it's on Amazon. And you get on there and it's like, oh, you got to pay us. And then you check Netflix and they like don't have it, and so like you're clicking through all these things. And by the time you get through it all, you're sort of like,
well, there's so many channels and there's no AI bot following you from channel to channel. Maybe that's the killer app, right?
An AI bot to help curation would be amazing.
Yeah.
I know you're fascinated with the changes with AI.
Yeah.
And so perhaps that's the $1 million unicorn startup idea.
Right. Well, let's not discuss that anymore, because we can go and make our own agreement and go and develop that, because it's all open source and anybody can do it.
Right.
Well, that's not quite true. But anyway, so your book, it's really like a blueprint, isn't it? Because of the process goes into all sorts of detail, shooting schedules, persuasive and professional emails, which is really, really helpful, I think. Kit, crew pyramids, crew conflict, locations, it's really detailed, so congratulations on it. I think it's a really interesting and valuable resource that we haven't seen before. So where do you think we're going to be in a couple of years then with the changes? Do you see the factual business coming back into the way it was? Do you see it expanding in new areas? And now you're working with IP and you're realizing the value of owning your own IP. Do you think really that's the future for independent factual TV producers, is owning their IP and building their catalog and monetizing it themselves?
Justin, that's a loaded question with many, many answers. I would start by saying that I don't have a crystal ball, but I don't think we ever go back to the way it was. I think everybody's pretty much set on that. I have a lot more optimism than I think most people do, purely because I think people will always want to watch content. Who the players are, how it gets distributed, how, what pipe gets it from, the network to your house. Those things might all change. But at the end of the day, for the foreseeable future, I think people like to go home and they like to turn on the telly and zone out, and they want something engaging, And so how much content gets made is going to be an interesting question, right? Because without having a programming schedule that every Tuesday you need a new 3-hour block, that could be radically different. I could foresee that. I think the key to it is to be always making content, right? Or always trying to make content, because the folks who I think are doing the best are the ones who have as many revenue streams as possible. Is owning your IP advantageous? I think so. Can everybody do it? Sure. Are there reasons to do a full commission? Absolutely. The Motor Trend series I did, for instance, that was a full commission. Up until this year, Motor Trend is being kind of known in the US for having a really long runway, and to build an audience with a talent and have a returnable, repeatable series. And so that was worth the risk to me to roll the dice there. That being said, so that was an opportunity where I knew I wouldn't own the IP, but I perceived an opportunity for a potential long running series. And so that trade was worth it for me. Everybody's going to have a different metrics with which to judge these things. I do like the idea for myself, and I think for smaller producers, that the more IP you can maintain, the better. That's very difficult to do in the United States because historically, most networks want to swallow up everything. And we have very different IP and copyright laws than the UK or any of the former British colonies do. And so I think that's one of the big divides is, in America, the corporation owns your thinking. Even if you're working for a big corporation, part of your contract usually is any IP you come up with while working for us, we own.
Shut up and make it, right?
Yeah. Here it's very different, and so this idea that you can structure deals in lots of different ways, I don't think that's something most people think about, right? I think most people are so excited, and certainly I was when I started, oh my God, Nat Geo wants to buy a show from me. Yes, I will sign on the dotted line, let's go. And what I think you realize as you get older and more mature and you spend more time in the business is that everything is negotiable. And so the question is how much leverage you have and how quickly you need to be in the field and what the levers are you can pull. And there's lots of different ways to get compensated. Money is not the only driver. Being able to retain your raw footage, being able to retain rights and territories and monetize those later, merchandising for some people. There are lots of different things and avenues. And so I think you need to be open-minded and avail yourself of all those possibilities, and then have that same hustle and drive that you had to get the show off the ground in those other areas,
And last question for you. Distributors are playing an ever-growing role, I think, in the industry of content production. Is that how you see it? And how do you see distributors' role going forward, particularly in the way that the industry has changed in the last 2-3 years, and maybe the way you think it might change in the next 2 or 3?
I think distributors are crucial by and large. I'm a small boutique production company, but even if I was 10 times the size, there's only so many networks I can get to myself. I'm not going to go to every single market. There are territories in this world that I know nothing about, or what, like if you asked me to list the top 5 networks in India, I couldn't do it. You need someone, I think, who has a finger on the pulse of these various markets. The way I view it, particularly to the genre that I spend the most time working in, cars. Cars are a global product. So to focus on one market's commissioning strategy is, I think that was kind of the light bulb moment of like, we sell these everywhere. Why aren't we selling the show everywhere? But having said that, like every country has different rules for the road. Well, every TV region has different needs and wants and that sort of stuff. And not every piece of product works in every market, right? Like you for years, one of the things people used to say is like, oh, Anthony Bourdain's shows don't travel. Like he's great for the US, but nobody in the rest of the world is going to care. Well, everybody, obviously that was horribly wrong. He became a huge international star. But I think you see that time to time still of like, oh, it has a British presenter. Will that work in America? Or it's an American. Will that work in Japan? That sort of thing. So having something that's easy to version, usually important. But distributors themselves, they have an army of sales folks, the ability to get out to other markets. They are constantly hustling on your behalf. And I think if you can build up a great rapport and a great relationship with specific distributors, and they become an advocate for you and your product, then it's a mutually beneficial relationship.
Dylan, thank you so much for coming in to TellyCast and chatting with us. Let's finish on one final point. If you're a young factual producer now, just coming into the industry, what would be your one piece of advice to them?
Given where the market is at today, I would say I think it would really behoove you to probably specialize in a specific genre and become known for that. I think what we're seeing with the market is the folks who had their hands in lots of different pies are struggling at the moment versus people who networks know can provide and produce a certain kind of content. If that content is working, if you're really known for the house flipping genre and that's what a network decides they need, you're going to be their first call, and when you're somebody who's a multi-tool player and good at producing content across the board, but isn't noteworthy in any one category, I suspect that could be really difficult right now. Again, I don't have a crystal ball and I don't know the future, but I think specialization probably is a good path forward for somebody coming up. You can always branch out later, but at least get some chunk under your belt where people say like, aha, I know this person's good at that.
Okay, so choose your niche.
Yeah, I think so. I would say double down on that niche, and that's not really any different than what we're seeing with, influencers and YouTube content creators, right? Like by and large, they all kind of figure out what monetizes for them and that's what they make.
Well, actually, in a way, that's the first port of call for your research. It's like, are there enough people watching this kind of niche? Then if there are, then maybe TV broadcasters might be interested in that content too.
Well, Justin, that's an interesting point because I think 10 years ago, if you put something on the internet on early YouTube and then you took it to a broadcaster, a lot of times I think they looked at it and were like, why should we do this? You've already done this.
People have already seen it.
Yeah, the idea isn't fresh. It isn't new. I feel like that paradigm has flipped 180. Yeah. And I think now that proof of concept thing is actually part of the metrics through which they view it of like, oh, wow, this is getting 500,000 views in only a week. That must mean there's an audience here. So there is a value to that. And if you were just coming up, that's another strategy to employ. And I think the real trick to it is if you're a young producer is you can't get stuck in only one way to do any of it, right? Like that's the big lesson here is that there's no set of rules that are absolutely unbreakable. Nobody's coming down from the mountain with a tablet saying this is the way it has to be. You need to look at what's right for you and you need to figure out like where you can move forward fast.
All right. Dylan Weiss, president of Cry Havoc Productions and author of the new book, Factual Television Producing. Where can you get the book? How do you buy it?
The best way to do it is Amazon.
All right. You can find it on Amazon, as you can pretty much everything. Dylan, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much, Justin. Pleasure to be here.
Well, that's all for this week's show. TellyCast was produced by Spirit Studios and recorded in London. Don't forget to subscribe to TellyCast on YouTube. We'll be back next week with another show speaking with the content industry's movers and shakers. Until then, stay safe.